after getting the job done, the most important consideration you as a contractor or freelancer probably have is how much of your contract value can you actually take home as net pay. And it is a pretty complex marketplace with lots of different ways of trading. You could go through an umbrella company, you could be self-employed, you could use a personal service company, or you could use a specialist tax structure. We'll not go into the details of how each of those works, but just look at the pros and cons in terms of take-home pay of each of those alternatives. So we start with an umbrella arrangement, which is the most convenient way of operating and often the one that any agency will direct you to in terms of getting underway as a contractor. It's very convenient, but it's not very efficient in terms of making sure that you maximise your net pay. And one of the reasons for that is that not only will you be subject to tax, but also both employees and employers' national insurance on all the earnings that you make. Now, that puts you at a distinct disadvantage. Typically, if your contract value is, let's say, £100,000 to make the sums fairly easy, then you're probably paying about £18,000 too much in tax compared with someone who's trading through a personal service company where IR35, the employment status legislation, is not applicable. So first of all, if you're trading through an umbrella company, worth serious consideration as to whether that's right for you. There are circumstances in which it's good, i.e. a very short-term contract between periods of permanent employment. If you're not in that situation, I would suggest an immediate review of how else you might trade. The second most popular way of trading is through a personal service company, and this can be the most tax efficient way of trading, although it's not always maximised as much as it could be. Typically, the way that you would trade through a limited company, assuming that IR35 is not applicable, is that you would take a salary that roughly equates to the annual personal allowance, around about £8,000 a year, and then all the other income from the contract you would take out of the company by way of a dividend. And there's nothing to stop you managing that income by leaving some of it in the company to minimise your own personal tax liability. If you might, for example, have a peer fallow period in the next tax year, when it would make more sense to keep money in the company and take it out in that tax year to avoid paying higher rate tax in this year. So the personal service company outside of the IR35 regime does have distinct advantages. Some of the other things that can come into play is that in certain circumstances it's quite conceivable that your domestic partner could be brought in to the equation and the shareholding, you could transfer shares to them and therefore split the dividend income so that you're both receiving dividend income, which will effectively mitigate the amount of higher rate tax that you pay. On top of that, in certain circumstances, and assuming that it's valid, it's quite feasible to employ a spouse within your company if there's a specific job that they are qualified and able to do. And if they don't have income from other sources, could quite justifiably earn an income in that way, which would be a tax deductible expense for the company. So there's a couple of things there that we get the feeling that some other firms of accountants may not direct our contractor and freelancer clients to, that are perfectly legitimate and quite feasible ways of running your business. Beyond that, there are other things that ought to be considered too. Making pension contributions is a tax efficient way of reducing the company's profits and associated corporation tax bill. It's perfectly legitimate to claim a percentage of your home office costs and deduct that from the company's profits as well. And some of the other things that are maybe a little bit less frequently thought of is that it's quite possible with some careful planning to, for example, invest in a buy-to-let property without having to take the funds out of the company through dividends in order to do so. So a personal service company in the right sort of environment can be a very tax efficient way of operating, but it does need to be considered carefully, and all of the steps that I've mentioned need to be properly thought through, and the circumstances in which they're arranged need to be real and not contrived. So that's fine if IR35 is not a particular problem for your company. Now, increasingly, IR35 is on the radar of HMRC, and it makes a lot of sense to review your situation to see whether it might be relevant to your circumstances. We have other videos and we're perfectly happy to speak to you about that, but it's not actually the subject of this particular video. But let's say, for example, IR35 is a serious risk to the way that you're contracting or your particular contract. Then maybe there is some consideration that could be given to an alternative way of trading through a specialist tax structure arrangement. These are many and varied, and some are less reputable than others, shall we say. However, it is in certain circumstances conceivable that by operating through certain alternative tax structures, the IR35 risk that you might otherwise be subject to could be mitigated, and at the same time the rate of take-home pay could still be in the region of about 80%. Now, as I say, there are lots of tax schemes in the marketplace, a lot less reputable than others, and one of the most important considerations in thinking about that particular area is whether the scheme in question is registered under what are called the DOTAS rules. This is the Disclosure of Tax Avoidance Scheme legislation, and if the particular scheme is not registered under the DOTAS rules, then it certainly would be extremely risky to contemplate it. So that's very briefly a run through of the options. It is possible to, in most circumstances, derive 80% plus of your contract value in take-home pay with careful planning and proper advice. So we'd be more than happy to help you in trying to aim for that objective. Do give us a ring to find out more.